I, at the end, decided to study yoga because from everything I tried until then, yoga seemed to be the spiritual discipline which, in a way, satisfied my taste for science as well. Hello and welcome to this lecture, which is entitled From Experiment to Experience, and on a wider title, on the common ground of science and spirituality. My name is Doro Bodea, and I will be your lecturer today. To maybe say just a few words about why I am talking about this subject, it is because I've been always, on one hand, interested in science. I have even a career in science. I've been learning and studying physics. But then I've been also interested in spirituality. And of course, that brought me at a certain point to the question if, in a way or another, we can merge these subjects, or if we can find, as I mentioned in the title, a common ground between them. Of course, looking into spirituality, I've been for a while studying different religions. Then I've been also studying a few different spiritual systems. I, at the end, decided to study yoga because from everything I tried until then, yoga seemed to be the spiritual discipline which, in a way, satisfied, if I could say like that, my taste for science as well. And this is exactly what I also would like to present to you today. Of course, nowadays, nonetheless, science became more or less the new religion. Almost everywhere we look, there is an argument which it is mentioning science, and I've just put here for you on the screen something which I found more or less funny, saying 10 scientific ways to know if your dog loves you. We find this kind of argument related to the scientific way, or to the scientific fact, or to the scientific data or experiments in almost every corners of the life. In fact, spirituality from this point of view is no different. We find a lot of publications on, for example, effects on prayer, praying in general, on well-being, on the restoring of health, but also on how in general we see the behavior of social groups and probably of societies per se. That is also why, just to give you a brief example, we have seen from the middle of the last century, around the 1950s, until now, a tremendous increase in peer-reviewed publications which are considering yoga in connection with, for example, physical health, or, for example, mental health, but there are, in fact, many other areas. So if you look just briefly on the graph, you will see that around the 2020, we have about 20,000 peer-reviewed publications on the yoga for physical health, and about 12,000, 13,000 for yoga and mental health, and that is a large amount, I would say. Besides this as well, we have seen that the realm of spirituality aimed to merge with science, and we have seen people which were deeply involved in the studying of various spiritual disciplines stepping into laboratories, like here in the picture you are seeing Mathieu Ricard spending time in the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig together with Tanya Zinger, and aiming to understand the mysteries of meditation, aiming to understand the science, so to say, behind meditation. And of course, out of this, I also gladly, truly invite you to look upon his books, to look upon his works, because they have a lot of value from that point of view. As well, we have seen other authors which aimed to bring somehow together the specificity of science and the specificity of spiritual practices. Take, for example, the latest books of Rupert Sheldrake, very interesting books, or one which I also would welcome you to look into it. It's called The Real Magic of Dean Radin, which also puts together almost everything in the realm of spirituality which has been, in a way or another, exposed to a scientific view, to scientific methodology, and so forth. Now, just to as well mention something here, in the very beginning of my yoga practice, this was probably the book which, in a way, opened my senses towards the possibility of putting these two realms together. The Tao of Physics, I think, is the first book I ever read, which aimed to put together science and spirituality. And the famous Professor Capra said, I'm quoting for you, the fact that modern physics, the manifestation of an extreme specialization of the rational mind, is now making contact with mysticism, the essence of religion, and manifestation of an extreme specialization of the intuitive mind, shows very beautifully the unity and complementarity nature of the rational and intuitive models of consciousness, of the yang and of the yin. If you don't know this book, though it's an old book, as well, I warmly recommend it to you. It's really wonderfully written, and it has a lot of valid arguments in this direction. And maybe a last quote here from one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, who said simply, a physicist is just an atom's way of looking at itself. Now, before I'm going towards looking at the idea of the common ground between science and spirituality, allow me to say a few things about science. First of all, if we look at simply defining what science is, we learn nowadays from the dictionary that science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. I took the liberty to add their inner and outer universe. Science does not refer only to the enterprise itself of collecting knowledge, of finding knowledge, but refers also to the knowledge itself, and especially to that type of knowledge which we say that can be rationally explained and reliably applied. Now, of course, one thing which it's also important to mention here is that in its original sense, science meant basically any type of knowledge, and especially that type of knowledge which people could communicate with each other and share. And maybe I could give you here just a few examples. For example, science was used to describe the natural way in which a certain plant grows. So something which could have been passed from generation to generation, from father to the son, so to say. As well, science referred to the manner in which a certain tribe, a certain society worshipped a particular god. That as well has been considered as science. Therefore, from this perspective, we can say that science distinguished as being a knowledge of nature, and of course, especially of that part of nature which is true and important for every community. Fact is that as we came towards our times, towards, let's say, the modern times, science started to refer not only to the knowledge itself, but in fact more and more to a certain manner of pursuing, of obtaining knowledge. That is why I would dare to say that nowadays science is often restricted to those areas of study which aim to explain phenomena which belong to the material universe. That is why, of course, here we have already many times a problem with elements of spirituality, which often tend to address that which cannot be seen, that which sometimes it is called subtle or even spiritual, of course, And thus, because of addressing that, it is often refuted by the common view of science. Now, especially from the 17th, 18th centuries, so we are talking now about the time of Industrial Revolution, scientists aimed to point, so to say, their studies towards discovering and formulating what they normally call the laws of nature. Thus, almost everything which has been discovered, has been studied, has been placed in one of these laws. And of course, I'm sure that at least some of these laws are common, are known by all of us nowadays. Let's take just a simple example of the law of gravity, which is telling us that we are attracted, so to say, by Earth, and that is the reason why we don't take off from the surface of the ground. Of course, what we also observed, and that's especially around the 19th century and forth, that science became increasingly associated with what we nowadays name the scientific method. The scientific method normally aims to define a disciplined way to study the natural world. So, a manner of studying which is, from many perspectives, we can say, defined in a certain way. And of course, out of this, those which were applying the scientific method, those which agreed to that type of disciplined way to study the natural world, were named scientists. And thus, from there, we kind of arrived to the point of naming a scientist only those, so to say, which are agreeing with such a methodology. Of course, the scientific method, once more, I mentioned before, represents a modality of seeking knowledge in what I called a disciplined way. Now, part of that discipline, it is first of all the idea of being able to reproduce certain kind of effects. So, if we once observe something, we aim to understand it, we succeed to understand it and to explain it. That means anytime further we can reproduce that which we have seen, and of course it will always be conformed to that explanation. That is why a certain pattern has been formed in the direction. Namely, usually we have a kind of a thought experiment, what we also call many times a hypothesis. And once we form such a hypothesis, which should be based on certain natural laws or principles that we already know, then of course we will aim to make predictions upon what would happen when we will apply that hypothesis. And of course, these kind of predictions are usually placed before we try to check out if that hypothesis it is correct. Of course, usually this approach it is done through thorough observation, so we look at mostly natural phenomena, but as well many times we aim to design what we call experiments. That is also why experimentation has become one of the important keys to science. And of course, now to create an experiment means to try to simulate a certain natural event under controlled conditions, and thus, of course, by gradually altering those conditions, producing very clear changes and so on, we can as well aim to observe what happens with that specific natural event. That is also why experimentation became probably one of the most known modality, or allow me to call it method, to establish a causal relationship. So that relationship, of course, it is between the specific set of conditions and the outcome of that specific experiment. That is also why, normally in an experiment, once we learned how to define the set of conditions, we should be able to both predict the result, but also, of course, we should be able to measure, to observe that result. Now, if such a hypothesis survives the experiments, then might be adopted afterwards as a scientific theory, and it tends to become a model. Of course, in this direction, we should understand probably that we as human beings seem to be, allow me to call it, modeling creatures. We tend all the time to produce models, to model what happens with ourselves, what happens with the environment, what happens to the universe, and so forth. So that is also why, of course, science found such a solid ground into our lives, because science often has the ability to satisfy our need for this kind of models.